The motorcycle sputtered to death in the middle of nowhere, steam hissing from its overheated engine like a dying dragon's last breath. Cale Voss kicked the machine's side with enough force to send pain shooting up his leg, cursing the gods of mechanical failure and his own stubborn refusal to accept help from anyone. 3 years of running had led him here, a desolate stretch of highway cutting through Oregon's high desert, where the sun beat down mercilessly in the nearest town, was a shimmering mirage on the horizon. His leather jacket clung to his sweat-soaked back, and the weight of everything he'd left behind pressed down on his shoulders like invisible chains. The explosion had changed everything. One moment he'd been Lieutenant Cale Voss, decorated bomb disposal expert with steady hands and nerves of steel. The next, he was watching his partner's body bag being loaded into a transport while brass-faced officials explained how equipment malfunction was just one of those things that happened in war zones. They'd offered him counseling, medals, honorable discharge with full benefits. What they couldn't offer was bringing Ryder back or erasing the image of his best friend's final confused look as the device detonated 2 seconds early, so he'd taken his discharge, sold everything he owned, bought the motorcycle, and started riding. No destination, no plan, no hope, just movement. Because standing still meant remembering. And remembering meant drowning in guilt that tasted like copper and smelled like burning metal. Now the bike was dead, and he was stranded with nothing but a backpack full of wrinkled clothes and a wallet containing his last $43. The sun would set in a few hours. Coyotes would emerge to investigate the fool who decided to have a breakdown in their territory. He started walking, boots crunching against asphalt that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. Throat was already parched, and mirages danced at the edges of his vision, or maybe those were just the ghosts that followed him everywhere. Whispering accusations he couldn't argue with, the rumble of an approaching engine made him turn. A dust-covered pickup truck materialized from the heat waves, slowing as it drew near. Cale's muscles tensed instinctively. 3 years of avoiding human contact had honed his fight-or-flight response to a razor's edge, and right now, flight wasn't an option. The truck pulled alongside him, and the passenger window rolled down with a mechanical wheeze. The driver was a woman with paint-stained fingers, wrapped around the steering wheel and wild copper hair escaping from a messy bun. But it was her smile that stopped his defensive preparations cold, not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was completely unguarded. In 3 years of careful distance and suspicious glances from strangers, no one had looked at him like he was simply another human being who might need help. "Car trouble?" she asked, and her voice carried the same warmth as her smile. Cale found himself nodding before his brain caught up with his mouth. "Bike. Overheated about 2 miles back. Hop in. I'm heading into Sage Hollow. There's a mechanic there who can probably help." Every instinct screamed at him to refuse to keep walking, to maintain the isolation that had become his armor. But the desert stretched endlessly ahead. Something about her direct gaze made his carefully constructed walls feel suddenly fragile. "I don't have much money," he admitted, hating how the words revealed his desperation. Her smile widened. "Lucky for you, Tobias owes me about 15 favors. I'm Lyra, by the way." Against every rule he'd lived by for 3 years, Cale opened the truck door and climbed inside. Sage Hollow turned out to be barely more than a wide spot in the road, with a general store, a diner that doubled as the town's social center, and a garage that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. But it was the building next to the diner that caught Cale's attention. Converted warehouse, with massive windows and abstract sculptures dotting the yard like colorful sentinels. "That's my studio," Lyra said, following his gaze as she parked outside the garage. "I came here 5 years ago to paint the desert, and somehow never left." Tobias turned out to be a grizzled man in his 60s, with oil-stained hands and an encyclopedic knowledge of motorcycle engines. One look at Cale's bike, which they'd towed in with Lyra's truck, and he shook his head gravely. "She's got a cracked cylinder head, son. Gonna need parts from Bend, and they won't be here till Monday at the earliest. Plus labor, you're looking at $600-700 minimum." Cale's heart sank. He'd expected expensive, but this was beyond his reach, even if he found work. How much to just get her running enough to make it to the next town? Wouldn't recommend it. She'll leave you stranded again, probably somewhere worse than here. I'll take that risk. Lyra, who'd been examining a vintage motorcycle in the corner, looked up sharply. Where exactly are you planning to go? The question hit him like a physical blow, because he realized he had no answer. For 3 years, he'd been running from something rather than toward anything. The admission settled in his chest like a stone. Away, he said finally. Something shifted in her expression, not pity, which he would have rejected instantly but understanding. Tobias, what would you charge for a basic tune-up and temporary fix? 200, but like I said, it won't. I'll cover it, she said before Cale could protest. Consider it a commission advance. I don't do commissions, Cale said quickly. I'm not an artist. Everyone's an artist at something. And I need help moving some large pieces for a show in Bend. Next month. Your bike will be ready by then anyway, so you might as well make some money while you wait. Every fiber of his being wanted to refuse. Staying meant forming connections. And connections meant eventual questions about his past, his nightmares. The reason he flinched whenever someone moved too quickly in his peripheral vision. But the alternative was walking into the desert with $43 and a death, which he'd been too cowardly to acknowledge. 1 month, he said, then I'm gone. 1 month, she agreed, but her smile suggested she knew something he didn't. That evening, she showed him to a small apartment above her studio. The space was sparse, but clean, with a bed, a kitchenette, and windows that faced east toward the mountains. As the sun set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Cale found himself standing at the window longer than he'd intended. Beautiful, isn't it? Lyra's voice came from behind him. She'd brought up clean sheets and a plate of food from the diner. I hadn't noticed, he lied. That's because you've been looking at the ground for so long, you forgot to look up. Set the plate on the small table and headed for the door. The sunrise is even better. Worth getting up early for. After she left, Cale sat on the bed and stared at the food, real food. It's prepared by someone who'd thought about his hunger without expecting anything in return. When was the last time someone had fed him? When was the last time he tasted anything? Besides gas station sandwiches and diner coffee consumed in anonymous silence, he took a bite, and the simple act of eating something made with care nearly broke him. Outside, the desert settled into its nocturnal rhythm. And for the first time in 3 years, Cale fell asleep without the sound of explosions echoing in. His dreams, the nightmares, came anyway, dragging him from sleep at 3 a.m. with Ryder's name on his lips and sweat soaking through his shirt. Cale stumbled to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass as he fought to separate dream from memory. The desert stretched out below, bathed in starlight that made the landscape look alien and beautiful. A soft glow from the studio. Windows caught his attention. Lyra was working, her silhouette moving among easels and canvases like a dancer lost in her own rhythm. Without thinking, he pulled on his clothes and made his way downstairs. The studio door was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled of turpentine and possibility. Lyra stood before a massive canvas, adding bold strokes of orange and red to what looked like a sunrise over distant mountains. She didn't look surprised when he appeared beside her. Couldn't sleep either? She asked, not pausing in her work. I don't sleep much anymore. The admission slipped out before he could stop it. Dreams or memories? The question was asked so casually that he found himself answering. Both. Same thing, really. She nodded as if this made perfect sense. I used to paint only in daylight. Thought darkness was the enemy of art. Then my brother died in a car accident, and I discovered that 3 a.m. is when the truest colors come out. When you strip away all the pretense and paint what you really see. Cale studied the canvas more carefully. The sunrise wasn't just beautiful, it was fierce, almost violent in its intensity. It's a kind of dawn that didn't just break, but shattered the night into fragments. Is that what you see? He asked. When you look at the sunrise? It's what I saw the morning after I got the call about Marcus. I stood in my apartment in Seattle, looking east, and realized that beauty and pain aren't opposites. They're dance partners. She stepped back from the canvas, finally turning to look at him fully. In the studio lights, he could see paint smudged along her left cheek and exhaustion around her eyes that matched his own. "What do you see when you look at it?" she asked. Cale wanted to say something safe, something that would keep his walls intact. Instead, he found himself staring at the painted sunrise and remembering the last morning he'd shared with Ryder. They'd been eating. Mr. Eason complaining about the heat when the call came in. Another device. Another chance to save lives by risking their own. Ryder had grinned at him and said, "One more dance with the devil, partner." "I see the last sunrise someone I cared about ever saw," he said quietly. Lyra's brush stilled in her hand. "Were you with them?" "I was supposed to be. I was sick that day, food poisoning from some sketchy chicken." Ryder went alone. The words came out flat, emotionless. He'd told this story to therapists and commanding officers, always in the same detached tone. The device was set wrong. Killed him instantly, and you'd think it should have been you. It wasn't a question. Cale turned to look at her, startled by her directness. Most people offered platitudes about survivors' guilt and the will of God. Lyra just waited, holding his gaze with steady patience. "It was my job," he said finally. "My device, my responsibility. He died because I wasn't there. Maybe. Or maybe he died because that's what happened that day, and you survived because that's what happened to you. Maybe there's no cosmic justice to it, just terrible randomness that doesn't care about our plans." She set down her brush and moved to a paint-splattered chair, curling up in it like a cat. "I spent 2 years after Marcus died trying to figure out why. Why did he leave the party early that night? Why did he take the mountain road instead of the highway? Why didn't I insist on driving him home instead of letting him go alone? Did you find an answer?" Found a different question. "Instead of asking why it happened, I started asking what I was going to do with the fact that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of creating something beautiful in a world that had shown me its ugliest face." Cale looked back at the canvas, at the fierce sunrise she'd painted from her own dark night. "And you decided to paint. I decided to live. The painting just happened to be how I chose to do it." They stood in comfortable silence as the real dawn approached outside, and Cale felt something shift inside his chest. Not healing that seemed too large and impossible, but maybe the first crack in the armor he'd built around his heart. When Lyra finally returned to her canvas, he didn't go back upstairs. Instead, he found himself picking up a brush. Drawn to a blank canvas in the corner, like a moth to flame dot, working with his hands again felt like rediscovering a lost language. Cale had forgotten that before bombs and timing devices, before precision and life or death calculations, he'd loved to build things. As a kid, he'd spent hours in his grandfather's workshop, learning to shape wood and metal into useful beauty. The sculpture started as an accident, while helping Lyra move her larger pieces for inventory. He'd noticed how one of her abstract forms would fit perfectly with another if he could just modify the base. Without thinking, he'd started sketching alterations in the dust on the workshop floor. "You see it differently than I do," Lyra observed, watching him work out the spatial relationships. "I see them as individual pieces. See how they want to connect?" By the end of the first week, he'd built a mounting system that allowed 3 of her sculptures to interlock while maintaining their individual integrity. By the end of the second, he was welding his own pieces from scrap metal Tobias had lying around the garage. The work was meditative in a way that surprised him. Unlike bomb disposal, where a single mistake meant death, sculpture forgave experimentation. You could try something, see it fail, and try again without catastrophic consequences. The worst outcome was wasted metal and time. "What is it?" Lyra asked one evening, finding him in the workshop behind the studio. He'd been working on the same piece for 3 days, a twisted form that seemed to be either falling apart or coming together, depending on the angle of view. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "It started as one thing and became something else." She walked around the sculpture slowly, studying it from different perspectives. "It looks like it's in the middle of transforming. It's like a chrysalis, but made of metal." The observation hit him unexpectedly hard. He set down his tools and really looked at what he'd created. She was right. The form captured the exact moment of change, suspended between what was and what could be. "I never finished anything before," he said quietly. In the army, completion meant mission success or mission failure. There was no middle ground, no process, just results. And now I'm learning that the process might be more important than the result. That night, Lyra convinced him to join her for dinner at the diner instead of eating alone in his apartment. The local crowd was small and curious, but respectful of boundaries. Cale found himself relaxing as the evening wore on, actually participating in conversations about weather and local politics instead of just enduring them. May, the diner's owner and primary cook, was a force of nature in her 70s who seemed to know everyone's business before they knew it themselves. She set a piece of apple pie in front of Cale without being asked. "On the house," she said when he protested. "Anyone who can make our Lyra smile that much deserves pie." Lara glanced at Lyra, who was indeed smiling, not the careful, polite expression he'd become accustomed to from strangers, but something genuine and unguarded. The realization that he was responsible for that smile sent warmth spreading through his chest. Walking back to the studio, under a canopy of desert stars, Lyra suddenly stopped and turned to face him. "Can I ask you something personal?" His defenses went up automatically. "Depends on the question. When's the last time you were happy?" Not content. Not content. Not distracted, actually happy. The question caught him off guard. He started to deflect, to make a joke, or change the subject, but something in her expression stopped him. She wasn't asking out of idle curiosity. She was asking because his answer mattered to her. "I can't remember," he said finally. "Maybe before I enlisted. Maybe not even then. I think I confused purpose with happiness for so long that I forgot there was a difference. And now, working with your hands, creating instead of destroying. How does that feel?" Considered lying, giving her an answer that would keep things simple. Instead, he found himself telling the truth. "Like I might remember what happiness feels like, given enough time." She smiled, then not the careful expression she wore for the townspeople, but something fierce and bright that made his breath catch. "Time is the one thing we have plenty of out here." As they reached the studio, Cale realized that for the first time in 3 years, the idea of having plenty of time didn't fill him with dread. Instead, it felt like a gift he might actually deserve. The panic attack hit him 3 weeks into his stay, triggered by the simple act of May dropping a metal tray in the diner kitchen. The clatter echoed through the dining room, and suddenly Cale wasn't sitting across from Lyra over coffee and conversation. He was back in the compound, listening to Ryder's voice over the radio as the timer counted down faster than expected. His hands shook as the familiar cocktail of adrenaline and terror flooded his system. The diner walls seemed to close in, and he could taste copper on his tongue, the same metallic flavor that had filled his mouth. When he'd seen what was left of his partner, "I have to go," he managed, pushing back from the table so abruptly that his chair toppled over, but the desert offered no escape from the memories. He found himself walking the same stretch of highway where Lyra had found him, his breathing coming in short, sharp gasps that never seemed to bring enough air. The rational part of his mind knew he was safe, knew the danger existed only in his head, but his body refused to believe it. Lyra found him 2 hours later, sitting on a boulder beside the road with his knees drawn up to his chest. She didn't try to touch him or offer empty reassurances. Instead, she sat on the ground nearby and waited. "I thought I was getting better," he said finally, his voice hoarse from hyperventilation. 3 weeks of normal, and I thought maybe I could be a regular person again." "Healing isn't linear," she said quietly. "It's more like a spiral. Sometimes you circle back to places you thought you'd left behind, but each time you're a little higher up, a little further along. How can you be so sure?" She was quiet for so long that he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight he'd never heard before. "Because I tried to kill myself 6 months after Marcus died." The words hit him like a physical blow. He turned to look at her, really look, and saw the faint scar along her left wrist that he'd somehow missed before. "I was so tired of carrying the pain," she continued. so tired of waking up every day to the same emptiness. I figured if I couldn't find a way to stop hurting, I'd stop everything. What changed your mind? I didn't change my mind. I failed. She smiled ruefully. Turns out I'm as bad at dying as I thought I was at living. Neighbor found me, called an ambulance. Oh. I spent 3 days in the hospital, hating everyone who'd kept me alive. And then a therapist asked me the same question I asked you. When was the last time I was happy? I gave the same answer you did. I couldn't remember. She said that maybe the problem wasn't that I'd lost the ability to be happy. Maybe I'd never learned how in the first place. Cale felt something click into place in his chest, a piece of understanding he hadn't known he was missing. You came here to learn how to be happy. I came here to learn how to be alive. The happiness turned out to be a side effect. She stood up, brushing dust from her jeans. You know what I discovered? Happiness isn't a destination you arrive at. It's not even a feeling you maintain. It's a skill you practice. How do you practice happiness? The same way you practice anything. You start small, you mess up a lot, and you keep trying. She extended her hand to help him up, like learning to trust that when someone offers to help, it's not because they want something from you. It's because they see something worth helping. He took her hand, let her pull him to his feet. Her fingers were warm and slightly rough from working with clay and paint, real in a way that grounded him in the present moment. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to be around people without waiting for them to leave. Then we'll figure it out together. That's what friends do, friends. The word felt foreign and precious at the same time. When was the last time he'd had a friend who wasn't also a fellow soldier? Someone whose relationship with him wasn't defined by shared duty and common danger. I might have another panic attack, he warned her. Probably. I still have bad days. 2. Depression doesn't just disappear because you find a nice place to live and work you love. She started walking back to Wardtown, and he fell into step beside her. But having bad days doesn't mean you're not healing. It just means you're human. As they walked, Cale felt the last of his adrenaline fading, replaced by something he was beginning to recognize as hope. Not the desperate kind that demanded guarantees, but the quiet kind that was willing to take things one day at a time. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, triggered not by therapy or conversation, but by the simple act of watching Lyra destroy one of her paintings. He'd come to the studio early to work on his latest sculpture and found her standing before a canvas with a palette knife, scraping away layers of paint with methodical precision. What are you doing? He asked, horrified. The painting was beautiful, a desert storm captured in motion, all dynamic energy and dramatic color. Letting go, she said, without stopping her work. I've been trying to finish this piece for 2 months, and it's not working. Sometimes you have to destroy something to find out what it was meant to be. Cale watched as she scraped away hours of careful work, revealing the ghost images beneath. Instead of loss, he saw liberation. The painting had been beautiful, but it had also been safe, contained within boundaries that didn't allow for true wildness. Doesn't it hurt? He asked. Destroying something you spent so much time creating? Less than living with something that isn't true. She paused in her scraping to look at him. The hardest lesson I had to learn was that holding on to something, even something good, can sometimes prevent you from finding something better. The observation settled into his bones like truth. That afternoon, instead of working on his sculpture, he found himself walking the desert roads, thinking about all the things he'd been holding on to. Guilt over Ryder's death. Anger at the military bureaucracy that had written off his friend's life as acceptable losses. Fear of forming new connections that could be lost just as suddenly and completely. But underneath all of that, he realized was something else. A deep, abiding love for the man who'd been his partner, his friend, his brother in all the ways that mattered. The guilt and anger were just the forms that love had taken when it had nowhere healthy to go. That evening, he did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He called Ryder's parents. The conversation was painful and awkward at first. They'd reached out to him after the funeral, but he'd been too raw, too consumed by guilt to respond. Now, hearing the joy in Mrs. Chen's voice when she recognized his number, he realized how his silence must have hurt them. We never blamed you, she said. when he finally managed to apologize. David talked about you in every letter, every phone call. You were the brother he chose, and he was so proud to serve with you. I should have been there, he said, the old refrain automatic. Yes, she agreed, surprising him. You should have been. And if you had been, you might both be dead. Or you might both be alive, or maybe just you would be dead instead. We'll never know, and that's what makes it so hard. But Cale, our son died doing work he believed in, alongside people he loved. In a world full of meaningless deaths, that has to count for something. After he hung up, Cale sat in his small apartment and cried for the first time since the funeral. Not the bitter, angry tears of guilt and rage, but something deeper and cleaner. Grief for a friendship lost, gratitude for the time they'd had, and slowly, carefully, forgiveness for the simple human fact that he'd survived when his friend hadn't. When he finally emerged from his apartment, he found Lyra waiting in the workshop. She took one look at his red-rimmed eyes and swollen face and simply handed him a cup of tea. Better? She asked, after he'd drained the mug. Different, he said. Maybe that's the same thing. She showed him what she'd done to the painting. Instead of trying to recreate the storm scene, she'd used the scraped areas to create something entirely new, a landscape that seemed to exist in the space between destruction and creation, where old forms dissolved into new possibilities. Beautiful, he said, and meant it. Like it's honest, she corrected. That's not always the same thing as beautiful, but it's always more important. Looking at her work, Cale understood what she meant. The painting didn't hide from the violence of its creation. Instead, it incorporated that destruction as part of its truth, transforming damage into beauty without pretending the damage hadn't occurred. I think I'm ready to finish my sculpture, he said. She smiled, and this time, her expression held something he was learning to recognize as pride. It's not in herself, but in him. In the progress he was making, the courage he was finding, the man he was choosing to become. Then let's go make something honest, she said. 6 months later, Cale's sculpture garden behind the studio had grown to include 12 pieces, each one marking a different stage of his journey back to himself. The latest was his most ambitious, yet a life-sized figure emerging from a cocoon of twisted metal, arms outstretched toward a sun that existed only in the observer's imagination. It's magnificent, said the gallery owner from Portland who'd driven down to see his work. Raw, emotional, completely unique. I could sell everything you have here within a month. Cale looked to Lyra, who was trying unsuccessfully to hide her excitement. In the 6 months since his panic attack, their relationship had deepened from friendship into something that didn't have easy labels. They weren't lovers, not yet, but they weren't just friends either. There were two people learning to be whole together, finding that healing was easier when shared. What do you think? He asked her. I think you have to decide what success looks like for you now, she said carefully. Is it about making money or making art? Being famous or being honest? The question would have terrified him a year ago. When success had been defined by military objectives and mission parameters, now he found the answer coming easily. I want to make things that help other people feel less alone, he said to the gallery owner. If that happens to make money too, great. That's the primary objective. They worked out a deal that let him keep half his pieces while sending the others to Portland for a show. The compromise felt right, maintaining his connection to Sage, hollow while sharing his work with a broader audience. That evening, May threw an impromptu celebration at the diner, and half the town showed up to congratulate him. Cale found himself surrounded by people who'd become genuinely important to him. Tobias, who'd taught him advanced welding techniques, Dr. Reyes, who'd quietly provided therapy without making it feel like therapy, even cantankerous old Pete from the general store, who'd apparently been following his progress with interest. You know what the real miracle is? May asked, refilling his coffee cup for the 4th time. You smiled more tonight than in your first 3 months here combined. She was right. Somewhere between learning to create instead of destroy and accepting that grief didn't have an expiration date, he'd rediscovered the muscles of joy, not constant happiness that was neither realistic nor desirable, but a baseline contentment that made the difficult days bearable and the good days extraordinary. Later, Walking home under the familiar canopy of desert stars, Lyra slipped her hand into his. The gesture was casual, comfortable, but it still sent warmth racing through his system. "So," she said conversationally, "how long are you planning to stay?" It was the question that had been hovering between them for weeks. His motorcycle had been fixed and ready for months. Technically, he could leave whenever he wanted. "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On whether someone I care about wants me to stay." She stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression serious in the starlight. What if that someone wanted more than just staying? What if she wanted building something together, creating a life that's bigger than just healing from the past? His heart hammered against his ribs, but not with the familiar rhythm of panic. This was anticipation, hope, the terrifying and wonderful prospect of choosing love instead of running from it. Then I'd say she found someone who's finally ready to stop drifting and start living, he said. Her smile was radiant, transforming her entire face with joy. When she kissed him, he tasted possibility and promise. The sweet potential of a future he'd never dared imagine. A year later, their wedding reception was held in the sculpture garden, surrounded by art that told the story of transformation and love that had grown from the shared soil of healing.
Ryder's parents came,
bringing stories and photos that let Cale celebrate his friend's memory instead of just mourning his loss. May catered, Tobias officiated, and Dr. Reyes gave a toast about the courage it takes to choose hope over fear. But the moment that mattered most came during the first dance. When Lyra whispered in his ear, "You found your way home?" Cale looked around at the community that had embraced him, at the art that had taught him to transform pain into beauty, at the woman who'd shown him that love wasn't something you earned through perfection, but something you built through daily choice. "No," he said, pulling her closer. We found our way to each other. Everything else was just the journey. Above them, the desert stars wheeled in their ancient patterns. And to people who'd been lost, discovered that sometimes the best compass isn't the one that points north, it's the one that points toward the person whose smile makes you remember who you were always meant to be.